In this section, we'll be talking about federalism, and we'll pay special attention to intergovernmental relations, that's relations between governments. The Constitution, drawn up in Philadelphia, abandoned the principle on which the Articles of Confederation had rested, that the United States was a federation of independent republics known as states. Instead, the Constitution divides power between a central government and its constituent governments, with some powers being shared, which is the concept of federalism. All acts and treaties of the United States, because of the Supremacy Clause, would become the supreme law of the land. State officials would have to uphold the Constitution even against acts of their own states. But on the other hand, the national governments would be restrained in two ways: the separation of powers and the system of checks and balances, which are discussed in modules 5.2 and 5.3 respectively. The Constitution provided for the following: inherent powers, delegated powers, implied powers, concurrent powers, and also those reserved to the states. The powers and the tug of war between the states and the federal government that began soon after the Constitution was ratified can be seen in important Supreme Court cases, such as McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, which is discussed in Module 1.1.1. And it can also be seen in the landmark 1824 Supreme Court case Gibbons versus Ogden. In Gibbons versus Ogden, the court had to interpret the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8. In the absence of state and government regulations, it was only a matter of time before Ogden, who had obtained an exclusive steamboat license from New York City, would sue Thomas Gibbons, who was operating steamboat ferries along the same route between New York City and New Jersey. Gibbons lost in New York state courts and appealed to the Supreme Court, which had to determine whether Congress had the sole authority to regulate interstate commerce, in this case, the licensing of steamboats operating between New York and New Jersey. Chief Justice John Marshall delivered a ruling in favor of Gibbons, the plaintiff. Marshall determined that the acts of New York must yield to the law of Congress. In other words, if a river passed through two or more states, it was a form of interstate traffic under federal control. The ruling strengthened the national government's power over that of the states. Another example in the struggle for power between the states and the national government can be seen when President John Adams signed the Sedition Act in 1798, which made it a crime to speak openly against the government. The Kentucky and Virginia legislatures passed resolutions declaring the act null on the grounds that they retained the discretion to follow national laws. In effect, these resolutions articulated the legal reasoning underpinning the doctrine of nullification, that states had the right to reject national laws they deemed unconstitutional within their borders. A nullification crisis came during Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1830s. Led by John Calhoun, President Jackson's own vice president, nullifiers argued that high tariffs on imported goods benefited northern manufacturing interests while disadvantaging economies in the South. South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification declaring both tariff acts null and void and threatened to leave the Union. This crisis was resolved, though South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union during the secessionist winter of 1860-1861. The next states succeeded after the Battle of Fort Sumter in April 1861, which was the first battle of the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, in Dred Scott versus Stanford, the Supreme Court ruled that the national government lacked the authority to ban slavery in the territories. But the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860 led 11 southern states to secede from the United States because they believed the new president would challenge the institution of slavery. Initially, Lincoln's goal was to keep the Union intact, but his position evolved on slavery. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing all slaves, but only in the states that had rebelled. It was the 13th Amendment that freed all slaves. The defeat of the South had a huge impact on the balance of power between the states and the national government in two important ways. First, the Union victory put an end to the right of states to succeed and to challenge legitimate national laws. Second, Congress imposed several conditions for readmitting former Confederate states into the Union. Among them was the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, finally defined what it meant to be a citizen of the United States. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, stated that no citizen would be discriminated against based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and gave blacks the right to vote. Between 1819 and the 1860s, with the exception of the Civil War, the Supreme Court settled the power struggles between the states and the national government. Be sure to review your readings and review this video if you need to, and do all of the questions thoroughly.